The cowboy bought a chained Apache for $3. When he took off the shackles, the whole town froze. The hot sun was high in the sky, beating down on the dusty streets of the small western town. Wooden buildings lined the main road, their porches worn and faded from years of wind, dust, and sun. The sound of hooves clattering against the dirt echoed as a few riders passed by, waving at familiar faces. Children ran barefoot, their laughter mixing with the occasional bark of a dog. Life moved slowly in this town as it always had, and people kept to their routines, cautious of strangers and wary of trouble. Among the townsfolk, there was a man named Eli. He was a cowboy, known for his calm demeanor and strong sense of justice. His leather boots were scuffed from years of riding, and his wide-brimmed hat shaded eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. Eli had a reputation for being fair, a man who never rushed to judgment, but he had also lived a life of solitude, wandering from place to place, carrying only the essentials and a few memories that weighed heavily on his heart. On this particular morning, Eli walked into the town's trading post, a small building that smelled of leather, wood, and faint smoke. It was run by a trader named Jackson, a man with quick hands and a sharper tongue. Jackson had a way of making a small deal feel urgent, always pressing for more, always finding a way to take advantage of those who were not paying attention. Eli was aware of this, but he had his own reasons for being there, reasons that were not about money or trade. As he stepped inside, the heat from outside seemed to cling to him, sticking to his clothes and hair. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and looked around the room. Barrels of supplies lined one side, sacks of flour and grains were stacked neatly in the corners, and weapons hung from the walls. But it was not the goods that caught Eli's attention. It was the sight of a man, chained and seated in the corner of the room, a man whose presence seemed both commanding and sorrowful at the same time. The man was an Apache, his skin tanned from years under the sun, his hair long and dark, falling in tangled strands across his shoulders. His eyes, however, were the most striking feature. They held a fire that refused to be extinguished, a quiet strength that even the shackles could not hide. He was tired, yes, but there was also a dignity about him that demanded respect. Eli could see that this man had endured suffering, but he had not been broken. Jackson noticed Eli's stare and grinned. "Ah, you're looking at him, huh?" he said, leaning on the counter. "I can get rid of him for $3 and he's yours. Not that anyone in town wants him. He's more trouble than he's worth." The words were harsh, but Eli did not flinch. He studied the man in the corner, noticing the bruises on his arms, the rope marks around his wrists. The chains were heavy, cutting into his skin, but the Apache sat quietly, refusing to plead, refusing to beg. Eli could feel a knot in his chest tighten. Something inside him stirred, not fear, not doubt, but a sense of responsibility, a need to act. $3, Eli asked, his voice calm, steady. "That's it," Jackson shrugged, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's it. Take him or leave him, don't say I didn't offer." The townsfolk who had gathered near the trading post whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, calling out warnings to Eli. "Don't, that man is dangerous," one said. Another muttered, "You don't know what you're getting into." But Eli only shook his head. He had heard enough of such warnings in his life, and he had learned to trust his instincts over the fear of others. He reached into his pocket and counted out 3 silver coins, letting them clink against the wooden counter. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet room. Jackson took the coins, his grin widening, and nodded toward the Apache. "He's yours now. Don't say I didn't warn you." Eli stepped closer to the chained man. The Apache's eyes met his, and for a moment there was silence. No words were spoken, yet communication passed between them, a recognition of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the burdens they each carried. Eli bent slightly, loosening the ropes that bound the man's wrists just enough to allow him to stand. The Apache rose slowly, his movements careful, as if testing the world for the first time in a long while. The townspeople outside the trading post pressed closer to the windows, their curiosity mingled with fear. They had seen many strange things in their lives, but they had never seen a man buy another human being simply to free him. Whispers spread like wildfire. Why would he do that? Is he foolish? Does he know what he's bringing into town? Yet Eli ignored the murmurs. He only focused on the man before him, on the courage and patience reflected in those dark, watchful eyes. Eli led the Apache out of the trading post and into the open sunlight. The heat pressed down, and the dust swirled around their boots as they walked slowly down the street. Children stopped their play, watching in wide-eyed wonder as the two men passed. Adults stepped back, unsure whether to greet Eli with respect or suspicion. For some, the sight of a man walking free for the first time in days, or perhaps weeks, was unsettling. They had grown used to control and fear, and this act of kindness disrupted everything they thought they knew. The Apache did not speak, but his gaze moved over the town with caution. Every sound, every movement, every whisper was observed. Yet there was also a subtle sense of relief, of recognition that he was no longer a prisoner. His hands, once tightly bound, now rested lightly at his sides. Eli kept a steady hand near him, not out of distrust, but to offer support if needed. He wanted the man to know that he was not alone, that he was safe, at least for the moment. As they reached the outskirts of town, Eli glanced over at the Apache. "You're free now," he said softly. "No chains, no shackles, you can go where you want." The Apache's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of gratitude passing through his expression. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and took a careful step forward. The townspeople, still peering from behind doors and windows, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The man who had been chained and sold for so little now stood with dignity and strength, walking beside the cowboy who had dared to show compassion. Eli knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, questions, doubts, and perhaps danger. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the simple act of doing what was right, of restoring freedom to someone who had been treated as less than human. And in the quiet understanding between the cowboy and the Apache, a bond had begun to form, one that would change not only their lives but the life of the entire town. The dusty road stretched out before them, and Eli felt a strange sense of hope. The town might not understand yet, and many might judge him harshly, but he knew that some things were worth standing up for, no matter the cost. As he walked beside the man he had purchased for $3, Eli felt that something significant was unfolding, a story that the town would remember for years, a story that began with courage, compassion, and the quiet resolve to do what was right. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The townspeople watched silently, unsure whether to cheer, to scold, or to simply stand in awe. Eli and the Apache continued down the road, leaving behind the trading post and the whispers, stepping into a new chapter of their lives. The world was uncertain, but in that moment, freedom, courage, and humanity shone brighter than the sun above, and for the first time in a long while, the Apache could walk without fear, and the cowboy had done something the whole town would never forget. Eli led the Apache away from the town and toward the wide-open space behind his ranch. The hot sun still beat down, but a gentle breeze stirred the dry grass, carrying the scent of sage and earth. The ranch itself was modest, with wooden fences enclosing a small herd of cattle and a few horses grazing in the distance. The smell of hay and the faint sound of creaking barn doors made the place feel alive, yet calm, a stark contrast to the cramped, dusty trading post where the Apache had been chained. The Apache's movements were cautious but deliberate. Each step was measured, as if he were learning the feel of freedom for the first time. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, but there was no fear, only a quiet alertness, a natural instinct that had been honed through years of hardship. Eli noticed this and felt a mixture of admiration and respect. The man had endured so much, yet his spirit remained unbroken. Eli paused by a large oak tree near the center of the ranch. Its wide branches stretched out like open arms, offering shade and a sense of safety. He knelt and reached for the heavy iron shackles that had bound the Apache's wrists. The metal was cold and rough to the touch, scarred from use and neglect. With careful hands, Eli removed the chains one by one, letting them fall with a dull clatter to the ground. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet air, almost like a signal that something important had changed. The Apache flexed his wrists, turning them slowly to ease the stiffness. For years they had been confined, bound by cruel restraints, and now they moved freely for the first time in what must have been a long while. He looked down at his hands, a mix of disbelief and relief in his eyes. Eli remained quiet, giving the man space, letting him absorb the reality of freedom. There was no rush, no demand for words. Some things were felt, not spoken. Finally, the Apache looked up at Eli. His gaze was steady, and for a moment the two men simply regarded each other. There was a silent understanding in that look, a shared acknowledgement of courage and respect. Eli spoke softly, breaking the silence. "You're free now. No chains, no one to tell you what to do. The world is yours to walk in as you choose." The Apache nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he were absorbing the weight of those words. Freedom, something so simple in idea yet so profound in reality, had finally been returned to him. He stepped forward cautiously, testing his new liberty, feeling the sun on his back, the wind against his face. Every movement was deliberate, yet natural, as if his body had remembered how to be unbound. Eli offered him a small cup of water from a leather pouch. The Apache took it with careful hands, drinking slowly, savoring every drop. It was a small gesture, yet meaningful, a symbol of trust and of human decency that had been missing from his life for far too long. The sun began to shift, casting long shadows across the ranch, but the heat did not seem to bother either man. There was a sense of peace in that moment, a rare calm that came after suffering and uncertainty. As the afternoon wore on, Eli showed the Apache around the ranch. He pointed out the barn, the stables, the small pond where the horses drank, and the fields where cattle grazed. The Apache listened quietly, observing, learning, and gradually allowing himself to relax. There was a natural rhythm to the land, a steady, dependable cycle of life that contrasted sharply with the chaos and fear of captivity. Eli could see the subtle signs of wonder in the man's eyes, the small expressions that revealed his growing curiosity and trust. Despite the calm, there was still tension in the air. Eli knew that the townsfolk would not easily accept the presence of a freed Apache. Stories traveled fast in small towns, and fear and prejudice often traveled faster. Yet he also knew that compassion, patience, and understanding could sometimes outweigh fear. This man, strong and proud, had been treated unfairly, and it was Eli's responsibility to protect him, at least for the time being. As the day turned to evening, Eli and the Apache sat under the oak tree, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, the colors reflecting on the dry earth. The Apache spoke for the first time, his voice low and calm, carrying a weight of experience and wisdom. "I have been bound before," he said, "but never like this, never so helpless." Eli listened, nodding. He understood that words were not easy for someone who had suffered so much. The man did not speak of anger or revenge. He spoke of experience, of lessons learned, and of endurance. There was a depth to his words that went beyond the surface, a reflection of years spent surviving against odds that most could not imagine. Eli realized that this man's strength was not just in his physical ability, but in his spirit, a resilience that could not be broken by chains or fear. The Apache, whose name was Nanton, began to share small stories of his life before captivity. He spoke of the mountains, of rivers that ran clear and strong, of nights under stars so bright they seemed to tell stories themselves. He spoke of his people, of traditions and skills passed down through generations, of lessons learned from elders and warriors alike. Every word painted a vivid picture, revealing a world that Eli had only glimpsed through fragments and tales. Eli, in turn, shared small details of his own life. He spoke of the open plains, of long rides across valleys, of nights spent under the sky, watching stars and listening to the wind. He did not speak of wealth or glory, only of survival, respect, and the quiet moments that made life meaningful. In these exchanges, a bond began to form, fragile at first but growing steadily with each shared story. The night settled over the ranch, and the sounds of crickets and distant animals filled the air. A fire crackled softly in a small pit Eli had prepared, casting flickering light across the two figures. Nanton sat quietly, absorbing the warmth and the freedom he had been given. The shackles were gone, but the weight of the past still lingered. Yet for the first time in years he could choose his next step, guided not by force but by will. Eli offered food, simple fare of bread, dried meat, and fresh water. Nanton accepted without hesitation, eating slowly, savoring each bite. There was a shared understanding in this small meal, a mutual acknowledgement of respect and trust. They did not need to speak of it, actions were enough. Freedom had been returned, and with it came the responsibility of navigating a world that had often been cruel and unyielding. Over the next few hours, Eli taught Nanton small tasks around the ranch. He showed him how to mend fences, care for the animals, and move quietly through the fields. Nanton's movements were precise, his instincts sharp. It became clear that years of survival and experience had honed him into a man capable of adapting quickly. He did not rush, but he observed, learned, and practiced, demonstrating a quiet confidence that Eli found impressive. As midnight approached, the two men sat in silence under the oak tree once again. The stars above were clear and bright, each one a tiny point of light in the vast darkness. Nanton's gaze lifted toward the sky, and Eli could sense a mix of reflection and hope. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding awaited them in the town. But he also knew that courage, kindness, and trust had been planted here today, and those seeds could grow if nurtured carefully. Eli looked at Nanton, a quiet determination in his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we start again. You decide your path and I'll be here if you need guidance." Nanton nodded, a small smile forming, a rare expression that spoke volumes. It was a gesture of gratitude, of acceptance, and of recognition. Freedom was not just a momentary act, it was a journey, and the journey had just begun. The night deepened, wrapping the ranch in a peaceful silence. The two men, one a seasoned cowboy and the other a freed Apache, shared a moment that would forever be etched in memory. It was a beginning, not just of a new day, but of a new understanding, a new bond, and a new story that would ripple through the town in ways neither of them could yet imagine. In that quiet night, under the vast expanse of stars, freedom was more than the absence of chains. It was trust, it was courage, and it was the promise of tomorrow, a promise that Eli and Nanton had begun to fulfill, one careful step at a time. The next morning, Eli led Nanton back toward the town. The streets were quiet at first, the townsfolk still busy with their early chores, tending to horses, sweeping porches, or repairing fences. Yet whispers spread faster than the wind, and before they had reached the main street, people had begun to notice. Eyes peeked from windows, doors cracked open, and curious heads popped out from behind barrels and wagons. At first, the townspeople did not recognize Nanton. He walked with a calm and steady gait, his posture upright, his eyes alert but not threatening. His long hair swayed slightly in the morning breeze, and his presence carried a quiet dignity. For a man who had been chained just a day ago, he moved with confidence, a reminder that freedom was not just a gift, it was a return of strength and self-respect. The whispers started low, almost like a murmur of wind. "Is that him?" one woman asked, clutching the doorframe. "It can't be," a man muttered, his face pale with disbelief. "The Apache, he's free." The words traveled quickly down the street, passing from one group of onlookers to the next. A few children stopped their play, pointing with wide eyes. "Mama, look, he's walking." Eli walked beside Nanton, keeping a protective distance but allowing him to move freely. He could sense the tension building in the town. People were torn between curiosity, fear, and admiration. Some were fearful of what they did not understand. Others, those who had grown weary of injustice, felt a cautious sense of hope. Eli's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger but awareness. He knew that their journey back into the town would not be easy. As they approached the town square, a small crowd had gathered. Traders, farmers, and even a few lawmen had paused their work, staring in disbelief at the sight before them. Nanton walked slowly, observing the faces around him without hostility, without anger. Every gaze that met his carried a mixture of emotions: fear, wonder, respect, and in some cases suspicion. One of the older townsmen, a gray-haired man named Thompson, stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly as he called out, "Eli, what have you done? That man is dangerous." "You can't just bring him here." Eli stopped and turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "Thompson," he said, "he is no danger. He is a man like you and me. He has been treated unfairly and I freed him. That is all." The townspeople murmured among themselves. Some shook their heads, unable to comprehend why Eli would take such a risk. Others were curious, their faces filled with anticipation. The town had grown used to rules, to fear, to suspicion. The sight of a man once bound in chains walking freely beside a cowboy challenged everything they thought they knew. Nanton, aware of the attention, remained composed. He did not speak at first. His eyes moved slowly across the faces, noting every expression, every gesture. It was clear that he understood the tension his presence caused, and yet there was no anger in him. There was only calm observation, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from his very being. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, stepped forward hesitantly. His eyes were wide with curiosity and he pointed toward Nanton. "Papa, is he really free?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy's father grabbed his arm quickly, pulling him back. "Stay back, son," he said sharply. "Don't get too close." But the boy's question hung in the air, a reminder of the simple truth that freedom was a gift worth witnessing. Eli knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Yes," he said softly, "he is free, and he has the right to walk where he wishes." The boy's eyes lit up, and for a moment, hope flickered in the faces of some townsfolk. They began to see not danger but courage, not threat but humanity. The realization that freedom could be restored, even to someone whom they had feared, began to shift the energy in the square. Then something unexpected happened. A woman, one of the town's long-time residents, stepped forward. Her face was lined with years of hardship, yet her eyes held a quiet strength. She spoke softly, but her words carried weight. "We have all judged too quickly," she said. "Perhaps it is time to see not what we fear, but what we can learn from one another." Her words caused a ripple through the crowd. Some nodded, while others whispered in surprise. Eli glanced at Nanton, who tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the woman's wisdom with a quiet nod. It was a small moment, but it carried significance. The first seeds of trust and understanding were being planted in a town that had long relied on fear to maintain control. Nanton began to speak, his voice calm and steady. "I mean no harm," he said. "I wish only to live freely, to learn, and to share what I know." His words were deliberate, carrying a weight of experience. The townspeople listened, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. His presence, once feared, now carried a strange sense of authority, not the kind that demands obedience, but the kind that commands respect through integrity and courage. One of the younger men in the crowd stepped forward, his face flushed with a mix of anger and curiosity. "How can we trust him?" he demanded. "How do we know he won't bring trouble to our town?" Eli stood firm, placing a hand gently on the Apache's shoulder. "Trust is built with time," he said. "You will see that he means no harm, but you must first open your minds and hearts. Fear alone should not guide your judgment." The young man hesitated, unsure how to respond. He glanced at the faces around him, many of whom now watched silently, waiting to see what would unfold. Nanton, sensing the tension, remained calm, his expression patient but firm. He did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stood, a symbol of resilience and quiet dignity, allowing his presence to speak louder than words ever could. As the morning passed, a few townsfolk began to approach cautiously. Some offered water, others small gestures of welcome. Eli watched closely, guiding Nanton when needed but allowing him to take the lead in earning trust. Slowly, the tension began to ease. People realized that the man they had feared was not a threat, but a person, strong, wise, and capable of contributing to the community. A group of children gathered around Nanton, their curiosity outweighing the caution instilled by their parents. They asked questions wide-eyed and innocent. "Where did you come from? How did you survive? Can you ride a horse?" Nanton answered patiently, sharing small stories of his life in the mountains, of lessons learned from elders and of skills honed through years of experience. The children listened intently, captivated by his words. Even the adults began to soften. They noticed the care with which Nanton treated the animals, the gentle way he handled objects, and the quiet confidence that radiated from him. It became clear that he was no ordinary man. He was someone who had endured hardship and emerged not bitter but wise. By noon, the town square had changed. What began as fear and suspicion had shifted toward curiosity and cautious respect. Nanton's presence, guided by Eli's support and patience, had begun to break down walls of prejudice. The townspeople were learning that freedom, courage, and integrity could exist in forms they had never expected. As Eli and Nanton prepared to leave the square and return to the ranch, the townsfolk watched silently. Some waved, others simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that things would never be the same again. The bond between the cowboy and the Apache had not only changed their lives, but it had begun to challenge the perceptions of an entire town. Eli glanced at Nanton as they walked away. "Today was only the beginning," he said. "They will need time, but they will come to understand." Nanton nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and contemplation. "I will be patient," he replied. "Change is not instant, but it begins with understanding." The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the streets. The town had frozen in disbelief when they first saw Nanton walking free, but slowly, like ripples in a pond, the shock was giving way to curiosity, respect, and the beginnings of trust. Eli knew that this was just the first step in a much longer journey, a journey that would test courage, patience, and the power of human decency. By evening, the town had returned to its routines, but the memory of the freed Apache lingered in every corner. People spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Some felt fear, but many felt something new, hope. Hope that freedom, respect, and understanding could exist even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Eli and Nanton returned to the ranch, the day's events heavy in their minds. They had faced suspicion, doubt, and fear, but they had also witnessed the beginnings of change. And in that moment, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they both understood that the story of the Apache's freedom was no longer just about chains removed. It was about the hearts and minds of a town slowly opening to the possibility of something better. The morning sun rose over the ranch, spilling golden light across the fields and painting the wooden fences with long, warm shadows. The air smelled of earth and hay, and the soft sounds of cattle lowing and horses shifting in their stalls filled the quiet morning. Eli moved with calm purpose, readying himself for the day ahead. Today would be different. Today was about more than freedom. It was about trust, understanding, and the careful work of helping a town see beyond fear. Nanton had awakened early as well. The Apache walked slowly along the edge of the pasture, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was a man of quiet observation, and the world around him was a mix of new sights and familiar instincts. His hands, once bound and roughened from the chains, now moved freely, adjusting to tasks that were simple yet unfamiliar in their freedom. Every small motion was a reminder of the gift Eli had given him and the responsibility that came with it. Eli watched him from the porch of the ranch house, leaning on the wooden railing. He could see the cautious curiosity in Nanton's movements, the way he examined the animals, touched the fences, and listened to the wind. The cowboy admired his patience and awareness. Nanton had a presence that demanded respect without a word, a quiet strength that drew people in instead of pushing them away. By mid-morning, Eli decided it was time to bring Nanton closer to the town, not for confrontation, not for pride, but for understanding. They would approach the town slowly, giving the townspeople time to see Nanton as a man, not as a story of fear. Eli knew that actions spoke louder than words, and the best way for the town to trust the Apache was to see him working, living, and helping in meaningful ways. As they walked toward the town, Nanton observed everything: the wind sweeping dust across the street, the children playing, and the townspeople tending to daily tasks. His eyes were sharp yet calm. He did not rush. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. Eli noticed the quiet dignity in him, and he knew the townsfolk would begin to see it too. When they entered the main street, a few early risers paused, staring. Some whispered among themselves, others stepped back instinctively. Yet, as Eli led Nanton to the town's well, a simple act of service began to unfold. Eli handed Nanton the task of helping carry buckets of water to the homes that needed it. The Apache accepted the task without hesitation, moving with careful efficiency, lifting and lowering each bucket with skill and precision. The townspeople watched silently at first, unsure what to make of it. But slowly, as Nanton continued, a shift began to occur. The young boy from yesterday peeked around a corner, pointing toward Nanton. "Look, Mama, he's helping," he whispered. His mother, standing nearby, nodded in quiet approval. Other townsfolk began to notice the same thing. The man they had feared was working, helping, and showing respect for those around him. Nanton paused to adjust a bucket that had slipped, glancing around to ensure no one was struggling. A small smile appeared on his face, a rare expression of satisfaction in helping. Eli noticed it and felt a sense of pride. The Apache was teaching the town an important lesson without even speaking, a lesson about respect, dignity, and the power of action over fear. As the morning wore on, more townspeople began to approach cautiously. A group of farmers offered to let Nanton help with repairing fences. He accepted, moving with skill and care. Each nail he hammered, each board he positioned, spoke to his patience and expertise. Slowly, people began to murmur among themselves, realizing that the man they had feared was not only capable but also kind, respectful, and hardworking. By midday, Nanton had become a quiet presence in the town. Children gathered around him, asking questions about the mountains and rivers he had described the day before. Adults observed from a distance, still cautious, but beginning to understand that fear could not define this man's character. Nanton answered questions carefully, never raising his voice, never showing irritation. His calm demeanor and patience began to win over the hearts of those who had doubted him. Eli stayed close, guiding when necessary but mostly observing. He understood the importance of letting Nanton take the lead in earning trust. Words could not convince people, actions could. Nanton's quiet efficiency, his care for the animals, his willingness to work alongside the townsfolk, all of it began to change perceptions. Around noon, Eli and Nanton returned to the ranch to prepare a simple meal. They cooked over a small fire, sharing bread, dried meat, and water. The air was filled with the scent of cooking, the warmth of the fire, and a sense of accomplishment. Nanton spoke softly about the skills he had learned from his people, how to build shelter, tend animals, and survive in harsh conditions. Eli listened intently, fascinated by the knowledge the Apache carried. He realized that the town could learn much from this man, not just about survival, but about respect, patience, and understanding. After the meal, Eli suggested they return to the town, this time with a task that would further demonstrate Nanton's character. The town's main street needed repairs. A fence along the edge of the schoolyard had fallen. Eli and Nanton walked slowly, carrying tools and boards. The townspeople watched as Nanton worked with precision, measuring, hammering, and adjusting each piece carefully. His movements were deliberate and skilled, demonstrating both intelligence and patience. A few townsfolk, inspired by his work, joined him. They began helping, guided by Nanton's quiet example. Eli watched with satisfaction. Slowly but surely, the town was beginning to see what he had known all along, that the man they feared was a person of honor, courage, and kindness. As evening approached, the repairs were complete. The fence stood sturdy and strong, a symbol not only of protection but also of the bonds being built between Nanton and the townsfolk. People gathered around, offering nods of approval, some even approaching to shake his hand. Nanton accepted their gestures with humility and grace, never boasting, never demanding recognition. The town had begun to thaw, its fear giving way to respect. Eli and Nanton returned to the ranch under the warm glow of the setting sun. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the horizon stretching endlessly. They walked in silence for a while, each reflecting on the day's events. Eli knew that this was only the beginning. Trust, once broken or absent, required time to rebuild. But today had been an important step, a moment when actions had spoken louder than fear and suspicion. By nightfall, the ranch was calm. The fire crackled softly as Eli and Nanton sat beside it, reflecting on the day. "You did well today," Eli said, his voice gentle but firm. "They are beginning to understand," Nanton nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "They will learn slowly," he said. "Change takes time, but every action counts, every choice matters." Eli smiled faintly. "Yes, and we will be here to guide them as they guide themselves." The night was quiet except for the soft sounds of the animals and the wind through the trees. Nanton and Eli sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet reflection. The bond between them had deepened, strengthened not just by freedom and trust, but by understanding and shared purpose. They were no longer just a cowboy and a freed Apache. They were partners, allies, and witnesses to a journey that was changing both the town and themselves. In the stillness of the night, under the vast expanse of stars, Eli realized something profound. Freedom, trust, and respect were not given lightly. They were earned, nurtured, and demonstrated through action. Nanton had shown the town that strength and kindness could coexist, that courage and patience could transform fear into respect. And in doing so, he had begun to change the hearts and minds of a community that had once been frozen by misunderstanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and perhaps new doubts. But for tonight, the work had been done. The seeds of understanding had been planted, and with care and patience they would grow. Nanton, once chained and feared, was no longer just a symbol of survival. He was a symbol of hope, courage, and the power of human connection. Eli and Nanton sat quietly, watching the fire die down to embers, each aware of the journey ahead. They knew that change required persistence, but they also understood the value of small steps, of daily actions that built trust and fostered respect. And as the night deepened and the stars shone brightly overhead, both men felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that they had begun something that could last far beyond themselves. A story of courage, freedom, and the power of human decency. The morning air carried a gentle coolness as Eli and Nanton stepped onto the ranch, the first rays of the sun painting the wooden fences and the fields in soft gold. The past days had been filled with cautious progress, small victories, and growing understanding between the Apache and the townspeople. But today was different. Today, the results of patience and trust would begin to show in ways that even Eli had not fully anticipated. Nanton moved quietly among the animals, feeding the horses and checking the fences. His movements were efficient, yet gentle, each action demonstrating his care and understanding of the land. Eli watched him, a sense of pride and awe swelling quietly in his chest. The Apache had become more than a freed man. He had become a teacher, a guide, and a quiet force of respect and dignity in a world that had often seemed harsh and unforgiving. By mid-morning, Eli decided it was time to return to the town once again. The town square had seen hesitation, curiosity, and cautious trust in the days past, but today they would witness something different. Today, Nanton would demonstrate not just freedom, but the strength of character that had earned it. As they approached, townsfolk were already out in the streets, going about their daily routines. When they spotted Nanton walking beside Eli, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a moment frozen in time. People paused mid-task, children stopped playing, and even the town's shopkeepers leaned out of their windows. There was anticipation, a sense of awe that filled the space between the buildings. Nanton moved with purpose, greeting a few cautious nods from the townspeople. He approached the town's well to help carry water, just as he had days before, but this time more confidently. The townspeople began to notice something remarkable. His movements were deliberate, efficient, and calm. Every action reflected not just skill, but a kind of quiet wisdom. Slowly, the initial fear that had gripped them began to ease, replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, admiration. Children gathered around, eager to ask questions. "How did you survive in the mountains?" one asked, eyes wide. Another wanted to know how he learned to care for animals so carefully. Nanton answered with patience, his voice low but steady, sharing stories of his people, the land, and the lessons he had learned from elders and warriors alike. The children listened intently, captivated by the tales of courage, resilience, and skill. Adults watched from a distance at first, still cautious, but slowly they began to step closer. They saw the care with which Nanton moved, the respect he showed for people and animals alike, and the calm confidence that radiated from him. They began to realize that the man they had feared was not a threat. He was a person of integrity, someone who could teach and guide, someone who deserved respect. A group of farmers approached, asking Nanton to help repair a broken fence on the edge of the field. Without hesitation, he agreed. Eli observed as Nanton worked alongside them, guiding hands that were clumsy or unsure. He did not take control. He simply showed, demonstrated, and encouraged. By the time the fence was sturdy again, the farmers were smiling, nodding, and shaking his hand with genuine appreciation. One of the older townsfolk, Mr. Thompson, who had once voiced loud warnings against Nanton, stepped forward slowly. He studied the Apache carefully, noting his quiet demeanor, his skill, and the respect he had earned. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling slightly but steady. I was wrong," he admitted. "I judged too quickly. You've shown us that strength can exist with kindness and courage with patience." Nanton nodded respectfully, acknowledging the words with humility. "It is not just my work," he replied softly. It is the work of all who are willing to understand and respect one another." His words hung in the air, profound and simple, and the townspeople reflected silently on their meaning. As the day progressed, more townsfolk joined in, inviting Nanton to assist with various tasks. He helped mend the roof of the schoolhouse, guided young boys in learning to ride horses safely, and even taught a few women how to identify medicinal plants nearby. Each interaction built trust, dismantled prejudice, and slowly transformed the town's perception of him from fearsome outsider to valued member of the community. Eli watched from the sidelines, a quiet smile on his face. He understood that freedom alone was not enough. It was the actions that followed, the demonstration of character and respect, that truly changed hearts. And Nanton, through patience, skill, and dignity, was accomplishing something remarkable. By late afternoon, the town square had shifted from a place of fear to a place of quiet admiration. People lingered, watching Nanton work and interact with others. Children laughed as he showed them how to throw a rope, farmers discussed strategies for mending fences, and even those who had been most skeptical found themselves quietly impressed. The Apache's presence had become a living lesson in courage, humility, and understanding. Eli decided it was time to bring Nanton back to the ranch before sunset. They walked slowly, allowing the townspeople to continue observing. Some waved, others called out words of thanks or admiration. Nanton responded with nods and quiet smiles, never boastful, never demanding attention, yet fully aware of the impact he was making. At the ranch, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Eli and Nanton sat beneath the oak tree, reflecting on the day. The fire crackled softly in a small pit, sending warm light flickering across their faces. "You've changed the town already," Eli said, his voice quiet but filled with pride. "People are beginning to see what I saw in you from the start." Nanton looked toward the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Change takes time," he said, "but every step matters. Today was important, but the real work is ongoing. Trust must be nurtured, respect must be earned daily." Eli nodded. "Yes. But you've done more in a few days than most men could in years. They are beginning to see that strength and kindness can exist together." Night fell, wrapping the ranch in peaceful darkness. The stars glittered above, and the soft sounds of animals settling for the night filled the air. Eli and Nanton shared a quiet meal of bread, dried meat, and water, savoring the simplicity and the sense of accomplishment. They had witnessed a transformation not just in themselves, but in the hearts and minds of a community. The next few days followed a similar rhythm. Nanton continued to work with the townsfolk, helping with chores, teaching skills, and demonstrating the value of patience, respect, and cooperation. Each act, no matter how small, built bridges where once there had been fear. The town, which had frozen in disbelief at first, now embraced the Apache's presence with a cautious but growing admiration. One afternoon, Eli and Nanton walked through the town together, and the change was undeniable. Children ran to greet Nanton, laughing and asking questions. Adults nodded in recognition, offering smiles and words of thanks. Even those who had once doubted him now engaged respectfully, seeking advice and guidance. The transformation was quiet but powerful, the result of patience, courage, and consistent demonstration of character. By the end of the week, the town was no longer the same. Fear had been replaced with respect, suspicion with trust, and prejudice with understanding. Eli watched as Nanton helped a young boy mount a horse, guiding him gently with skill and patience. The scene, simple as it was, spoke volumes about the power of empathy and action over judgment and fear. As evening fell on the seventh day, Eli and Nanton sat once more beneath the oak tree at the ranch. The wind whispered through the branches, and the distant sounds of the town carried faintly on the breeze. "We've made a difference," Eli said quietly. "The town is beginning to understand what freedom and respect truly mean." Nanton nodded. Yes, but the work continues. Trust and understanding are fragile. They must be maintained, nurtured, and protected. But today we have taken a step forward. Eli smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the journey they had undertaken. And tomorrow we keep going, together. Under the stars, with the fire burning low, the two men reflected on the path they had traveled. Nanton, once chained and feared, had become a symbol of hope, patience, and dignity. Eli, the cowboy who had taken a simple but courageous step, had shown the town the power of compassion and action. Their bond had grown strong, built on respect, trust, and shared purpose. In the quiet of the night, the ranch seemed to breathe with a new sense of possibility. The town, which had once frozen in fear, would never forget the lessons of courage, kindness, and understanding. And the story of the Apache who walked free, guided by a cowboy's quiet courage, would live on in memory, a testament to the power of human decency and the lasting impact of even the smallest acts of kindness.